Dan Sisson is with us. It's Thom Hartmann University, our book club, as it were, the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. We're going through Dan's new book. It's a re-released after 40 years, a brilliant piece of scholarship. It's titled The American Revolution of 1800. And Dan Sisson, the distinguished professor of American history and the revolution coming our way at Thom Hartmann University on the banks of the Potomac, and adjunct faculty member at Eastern Washington University, where he teaches the history of technology in the engineering department. Dan, welcome back.
Well, thank you, Tom.
It's great to have you. So we are now up to chapter 5 in the book.
Right.
In the book, the American Revolution of 1800. And first of all, you want to just recap why the title, The American Revolution of 1800?
Because it was the first time in anybody's experience in human history in which a group of people got together and peacefully overthrew the existing regime and established a democratic society. And we tend to forget all that. Up until that point, all changes of power had occurred with tremendous amounts of bloodshed and fighting and destruction. And Jefferson was able to pull this off, which I think is one of his greatest accomplishments. Yeah. And we hardly ever celebrate it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You might want to move your microphone down about an inch so it's a little closer to your mouth. Chapter 5 is titled The Politics of Faction. And we talked about faction in Chapter 1, that James Madison in the Federalist Papers defined faction as basically a group of people who are looking out for their own interests at the expense of the nation or the community at large. And correct me if that's an inaccurate portrayal.
No, it's right on.
Okay.
And they destroy democratic societies and republics.
Yeah. So how is that different? How is the politics of faction, which is the title of Chapter 5 of your new book, The Revolution of 1800, The American Revolution of 1800, how is Chapter 5, the politics of faction, different from the politics of revolution, which is the main theme of the book, and which was Chapter 4. We talked last week about the French Revolution, all that kind of thing. Revolution gone right, revolution gone wrong. This is the politics of faction. Why?
Well, because one of the things that we tend to forget is that when our country was founded, it was the first time in almost 2,000 years that a real republic had been established. Nobody had any precedents. There was nobody alive who'd seen one. And so everything that they were doing was for the first time, and they were trying to see how all of these things would work out, all the institutions, all the theories that they had come up with, all the ways that they'd ransacked history to try to make a government that would depend on the people for sovereignty and would give people freedom and liberty. And so they were experimenting. And so when the first sessions, the first 2 or 3, 4 sessions of Congress, they began to see a picture emerge that was rather shocking. But it had to emerge piecemeal before they began to realize that the institutions were endangered. And what I'm talking about here is, say, let's just focus on the influence of one man, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was a guy who began to wield influence on a level or scale that nobody had ever anticipated. He got to the point where he literally controlled George Washington and the decisions that he made. He had began to bribe and corrupt people in the legislature, and this was a violation of the separation of powers doctrine. And they looked at that with appalling concerns because they knew if you begin to break that down, then liberty is not going to be safe under constitutional government. And so we sort of—
Wait a minute. So Alexander Hamilton was essentially doing the same thing that the billionaires, the Koch brothers, Shelley Adelson and whatnot are doing right now, buying politicians?
Absolutely. I mean,
and it horrified the founders?
It absolutely did. They were terrified of this, and we can talk about that later. But this was the sign of corruption at the deepest level, that you don't have respect for institutions. And so you can look at some of the issues like the funding and assumption plan. You can look at Hamilton's ability to write a piece of legislation, give it to a senator or a congressman, have it introduced, and then guarantee that the bill was going to pass.
Hamilton was a one-man Alec.
Absolutely. He was just a power. He was as I think it was either Madison or Jefferson described him as a force composed of one. meaning that he was turning the government, and he was turning it in the direction of what we would call an aristocratic system or an imperial system, which is what everybody knew at the time. Right. And Jefferson and Madison and these guys would sit around and look at this and say, my God, we're abandoning the things that we fought for. And so Jefferson, by 1795, was saying that the idea of a republic is up in the air.
And in 1795, this was the last. Yeah. This was one of the last years of the George Washington administration.
Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State in December 1793, and the last year of the Washington administration is 1795, and they are worried. Madison, at one point, is looking at this, and he's saying they're going to be able to achieve by corruption what they couldn't achieve by force, meaning that the British were coming back. And you got to remember, the British never respected the Treaty of Paris. They kept the forts that they
had. Which ended the Revolutionary War.
Yeah. And they kept the forts up around the Great Lakes. They refused. They were impressing our seamen. We knew about that. This was a declaration of war. Yeah. And I think that Hamilton and others were attempting to get us to declare war on France so we would be thrown into the arms of Great Britain. And so Madison and Jefferson are looking at all this, and they're seeing these factions that are operating in foreign policy. They're operating with the economy, with the Bank of the United States. They're doing everything possible to force us down the road in which we abandon Republican principles and become, again, a satellite of Great Britain.
Yeah, and that would be small r Republican principles, because that Democratic Republican Party that Thomas Jefferson formed is today called the Democratic Party. The first two or three administrations, I mean, for people who never memorized the presidents, we had George Washington, and he served 2 terms. He was followed by John Adams, who served 1 term, who was followed by Thomas Jefferson, who served 2 terms, who was followed by James Madison, who was the father of the Constitution. The Adams administration really started going down this road of what I would call fascism, merging with wealth and power and suppressing voices of dissent, the Alien and Sedition Acts, things like that.
That's right.
But as much conflict as there was, and Jefferson was his vice president, and he left town the day that the Alien and Sedition Acts were signed and things like that. But even in the face of all that, there were some things that all 3 of these guys, Jefferson, Madison, and Adams, agreed on or talked about, these charges and countercharges about faction and party. Do I have that right?
That's right. I think that
they were all freaked out by Hamilton.
They all were. In fact, Adams, it turns out, to me, the real story about John Adams and his conversion is that he never suspected that Hamilton had as much influence in the Washington administration, who would transfer that influence into his own administration. And so when Adams would convene his cabinet, he'd have the Secretary of War, the Secretary of Treasury, all these people, they would all agree with Hamilton, who wasn't even there, and he would call the shots from behind the scenes.
Wow. And, he was even out of power at that point.
Absolutely.
Incredible. Dan Sisson is with us. It's Thom Hartmann University, our book club. The American Revolution of 1800 is the new book. Professor Dan Sisson will be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
There's not a website for this, by the way. You can check out the American Revolution of 1800 at any online bookstore or at your favorite physical bookstore. Welcome back. Dan is with us. Dan, you mentioned in your book, The American Revolution of 1800, that the people who criticized factions finally reached a point where they were rallying around the Constitution instead of just complaining, voicing criticisms. Is this some kind of a special legacy from the founding generation that we see to this day? I mean, John Boehner, for example, is accusing Obama of violating the Constitution. Everybody's wondering whether shutting down the government over a budget battle is truly constitutional or is anti-constitutional. Are they supporting the great traditions of America? Are they spitting in the graves of the founders?
Well, this shows you the difficulty of being able to understand this dynamic relationship between party and faction. And when Tocqueville came over here, he was astounded that the Americans were all talking about the Constitution. And no other society in history that I know of, I mean, people talked about authority and who had power and everything else, but the citizenry didn't use the Constitution as a constant frame of reference, which was the shared value system that we all respected, and we all understood that that Constitution is what gave stability to our lives. And so whenever you wanted to disagree with your opponent, or you had something that you wanted to criticize, you would always try to fit it into the framework of the Constitution to say whether it was for the Constitution or against the Constitution. And one of the worst things that you could say to an opponent was that you're violating the Constitution and therefore you can be stopped legally or something similar to that. And today, you know, we do the same thing. We go to court because we know that the Constitution is going to resolve, or we hope it will resolve, our differences legally. And we all accept that. And I think that this is one of the most important legacies of all. And to me, this was almost the thing that Jefferson and Madison and the opposition at that time sort of founded, a tradition in which you could use the Constitution as the fulcrum with which to oppose a group of people who may be in power, but they were going beyond their powers, and they were literally endangering everybody.
It sounds to me, Dan, like what you're describing is that the Constitution has become our secular Bible. And if that's the case, what was our Bible prior to the Constitution?
There was no Bible. It was the authority of the British Crown. And that's a great analogy. I like that. And so instead of quoting chapter and verse in the biblical scriptures, what we do is we quote chapter and verse in the Constitution. And if you try to suppress the First Amendment, like John Adams did with the Alien and Sedition laws, then I can say to you, you're outrageous, and you know there isn't going to be any freedom if you get away with this, and I'm going to oppose you. And so we've carried that tradition forward, and it's an honorable one. And I think that this is why we rely, you know, on lawyers, and why we have people who have real insight into our Constitution, and they write about it. And we respect that, and I think that this is what has helped America, you know, stay together as a nation.
Yeah, the idea of a secular, maybe not Bible, but at least 10 Commandments, I find fascinating. We'll be back. Dan Sisson is with us. He is a professor at Eastern Washington University and also here at the Thom Hartmann University. He's the author of the new book, The American Revolution of 1800. Stick around. Past the hour, the place where smart people get their news, the Thom Hartmann program. Welcome back. Dan Sisson is with us, the author of The American Revolution of 1800 and distinguished professor of American history and the revolution coming our way at the Thom Hartmann University here on the banks of the Potomac, and adjunct faculty member at Eastern Washington University, where he teaches the history of technology in the engineering department. And a tip of the hat and many thanks to the good folks at Eastern Washington University who are bringing Dan to us via Skype for this conversation. We're now up to Chapter 5 in the American Revolution of 1800, and the chapter is titled The Politics of Faction. Dan and I were just talking about how in the United States, we have, since the founding of the Republic, essentially used the Constitution as a secular form of the Bible, or at least the Ten Commandments. It's been our pole star, we point to that, and is it consistent with that? And I had asked Dan the question, if that's a reasonable analogy, during the founding era in the 1700s and the early 1800s, were the founders and were the early politicians in America constantly quoting the Constitution the way that Ted Cruz does now, or the way that I do, for that matter, people on the left and the right, or not? And if so, what had preceded the Constitution as the secular Bible for the colonists in North America, or for people all around the world? And typically, what is the secular Bible in other countries? Dan, you want to just give us a quick recap of that?
Well, I could say that what preceded that, say if you took the period before the Revolution, then you would look at the writs of assistance that the British attempted to impose on the colonists. And you would look to James Otis Jr. of Massachusetts, and you would see that his rallying cry in court, by the way, I mean, there was a select number of lawyers, et cetera, who were interested in this problem. It wasn't made public, to the general commonwealth, I guess. But people were upset about this, and they knew it violated a right. And there was this vague entity 3,000 miles away called the British Constitution that everybody knew that the ministry and the king were not respecting, but it was something that had to do with the natural rights of mankind. And I think that you go back to that literature of the 17th century in which they're talking about natural rights, and you all of a sudden you realize that this was what played out in America. It was distinct from what was going on in Great Britain. And the Americans realized that the only safety they had was with this body of literature that sanctified what was called the British Constitution, even though the administration was not living up to it.
Right. I thought Britain never had a constitution. I thought it was based on common law.
Well, they have things like the Petition of Right, the 1620s, and they have Magna Carta, and there's a whole
right. But those in aggregate make up the British common law, don't they?
They do. But
so,
see, we were the first nation to have a written constitution.
Okay.
Ever.
Ever?
Yeah, that's right. In any time in history.
Whoa.
You bet.
Okay, so back to Chapter 5, The Politics of Faction, in Dan Sisson's new book, The American Revolution of 1800, which you could find in your favorite bookstore. You can check it out in the library. If they don't have it, just ask for it. They'll get it. And, of course, you can find it in the online bookstores. Great gift for the holidays. We've emphasized terrorism in the United States since 9/11. It seems to the events of 9/11 were so hyped both by the media and by the Bush administration that they have, arguably in many ways, changed not only the nature of the body politic in America, but even the value systems of our country. Was there a similar fear of terrorism during Jefferson's time? I mean, this was the administration 2001 to 2009 that just preceded the invasion from Canada. The War of 1812.
That's right, but even prior to the War of 1812, like we were talking about a minute ago, you have to realize that most of the leaders of the country, especially after Jefferson, knew that the British had some intention of coming back and trying to reclaim this territory in this part of the world. Their imperial system was going to demand that. And so what they were worried about was counter-revolution. All this business about factions and the politics of faction, Jefferson and Madison and their friends, they watched as the legislature began to cower. In the British system, they have rotten boroughs, and so people are just bought and paid for, and they guarantee enough votes to get a bill passed. Well, every party that we know of is attempting to get majorities. They'll do the same thing, and the most recent invasions by the Koch brothers and ALEC and all these other organizations distributing money literally are reproducing the system that the founders were afraid of.
So how did Jefferson respond to this kind of Koch brothers, ALEC, corrupt Alexander Hamilton being the David Koch of his day, I guess? How did Jefferson respond to this?
Well, this is a good question, because what it does is it highlights the major difference between Jefferson and, say, John Adams. Now, remember, John Adams is president, and he has all of these rebellions that are taking place. I mean, you can start with the Shays Rebellion. And you can see
we have just 1 minute, by the way, Dan. Just 1 minute.
Okay. All right. So you got Shays Rebellion, you got Fry's Rebellion, you got all kinds of what they call Gallatin's Rebellion. You got Genet with all the Frenchmen, and so here's John Adams in the White House, and they've got 10,000 people out there protesting in the streets, and he is really upset about this, and he calls for guns to be brought from the armories through the back doors to the White House, and he's got a crowd of servants. So he's writing this letter to Jefferson years later, and he says, and where were you in all of this? You were lost in your philosophical tranquility, and Jefferson had to laugh when he saw that, because what Jefferson saw was that Shays' rebellion and Fry's rebellion and all these things were like natural storms in the atmosphere, and he encouraged us. He said, the more rebellions we have, the more the spirit of liberty will be kept alive, and this is what we need to keep our rights. And so
Jefferson would be very enthusiastic about Ferguson.
Absolutely. He would say, this is the natural thing, you better pay attention.
Amazing. Dan Sisson is the author, and the book is The American Revolution of 1800. And Dan, thanks so much for being with us today.
You bet, Tom. Thank you.
Always great to see you. Great to talk with you. We'll be back. It's 28 minutes past the hour.